Hi everyone, thank you for being here. I know I'm in between you guys and alcohol, so thank you for coming anyway. So, Chief Scientist is quite the title. I'm pretty proud of it, but not everyone actually knows what it means. That's actually one of the most common things people say, like, what do you do at a trade association? I spend a lot of my time working with electric co-ops who are small, not-for-profit electric utilities. My job is essentially to look at the future for them and see how we get there in a way that keeps their power affordable, clean and reliable. So my job is to help them with all sorts of things from distributed resource integration, cybersecurity of course, and everything else that comes. Essentially I'm a therapist for a lot of people as well. They call me with their problems and I get to help solve them, which is pretty cool. So I wanted to start with a really difficult question, or it's a difficult one for me when we're looking at different technologies. Imagine you are one of these electric utilities, some of you are, but imagine you're a really small one and you have about 100K left in your budget at the end of the year that you need to spend and you have some ideas of what to do it on. Which one of these things would you actually spend that on? Would it be new poles? You can buy probably a mile of distribution poles with that. Weatherization for your low-income customers, they looking at how to improve the housing stock. People, do you want another person? Okay, a relatively cheap person compared to some of your salaries, but a person to work there. Or a product, do you want to buy a cybersecurity product to help you with monitoring your system? I know that answer isn't number 4, so we're all clear, but there's a number of things that you can spend. I had another way to also frame this question, which was imagine your neighbor is having trouble paying their electric bill. You know they're in trouble. You actually want them to buy your product. You're an ICS security vendor. You want them to buy your product at the utility. How do you explain to your neighbor that their power has to cost 2 cents a kilowatt hour more from now on because they had to buy your product? What do you think you can say to them that will help them explain that? That's the sort of thing we have to deal with on a daily basis because these small utilities are generally not really able to afford to do much without increasing the rates. So how do you actually explain that is something I want you to all think about while I'm talking. So what's been going on? There's been a number of years of us focusing on industrial control system security for electric utilities. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I really do believe truly that fundamental change is needed in these programs to actually help us serve small utilities. While we've talked about it, we've scared them, we've done everything to get them to install and improve the visibility. At the same time, it's not really working. We're not really looking to do that because there is just other things that are more important for them to be working on just now. Be that the hurricane that came in, be that just that they need to improve their system reliability. We just need to look at how we do these programs differently and what tools we actually really need in the system. We've also spent the last couple of years somewhat shifting responsibility for monitoring. Not the blame though. When you work with these utilities, a lot of the time just now you'll hear different vendors are in the news talking about the biggest problem we have, how the small utilities aren't doing it well enough. Well, we're shifting the responsibility of these critical infrastructure problems somewhat to the large vendors who are collecting lots of information, but we're not necessarily continuing to change the blame because if the lights go off, it's still the utility, the small utility that's blamed, it's still the customers screaming at them that they need to get the lights back on. We're not shifting the blame for any of these events, we're really just shifting responsibility if we're talking about them. One of the questions we keep hearing, who is actually critical and who are you going to regulate? We really can't get away from the regulation word. We know it's coming, we've heard it, people are talking about it, especially for the electric distribution system. But who's really critical in that system is kind of a problem. We're not really sure how to define that just now, and it's something I'm very willing to talk to everyone in this room about. But how do we define who's critical when some of these utilities are, say, serving 7,000 customers, also happen to serve a large military base that's actually only one customer, by the way. They serve a large military base, or they serve something else. Their hospitals are still critical. All of these things are still there. But how do we actually redefine that so that it makes more sense for these size of utilities? Who you're going to regulate is something I'll talk about in a second, but there's just a mass change in ownership models across the grid. We hear about this in other conferences. You hear about the change in energy transition, distributed resources. Who are you actually going to regulate when you talk about the electric distribution system is a really big challenge. Something I've heard from a number of vendors is that there's no return on investment from working with small utilities. I'm laughing a little here because I know half of you are probably growling at me right now and I'm sorry. But we hear this pretty frequently, that there's no return on your investment if you're going to work with them. It depends what you think that investment is. the investment that you might be making is to actually improve national security, as many are claiming. If that's not a return, then what does that really mean? And lastly, what I'm going to talk about is really knowing what and who you're looking at. I had someone come to me recently and they're like, we're trying to work with all these electric co-ops. Does anyone actually know where the CISOs are to talk to? I'm like, I think that might be me. So people aren't necessarily understanding who they're working with in these environments, and I think that's really important. So I have to have a map. Apparently everyone has a map in their slides. So this is who I actually work with, and this is when I say, do you want to listen to me about this? This is why you should maybe listen to me about how to work with small utilities. I work for NRECA. I actually just heard someone say they have no idea who that organization is. That's great, I'm cool with that. America's Electric Cooperatives. Essentially, there's about 900 of them in the country. They're all small, as in the average size of an electric co-op is about 50,000 customers. We do have up to 1.9 million, but yes, they're very small in general. It's split between distribution and generation and transmission, mostly distribution, but we do have 63 G&T or generation and transmission entities that generally then serve the distribution co-ops. The co-ops serve about 21 million different businesses. They are all, though, not-for-profit and member-owned, so they're actually not public utilities, they're private. They're member-owned, but they are all not-for-profit, so when I mentioned the think about if your rate went up by 2 cents, is because they have a direct cost map there as well. One thing that's important, they do serve about 42% of the nation's distribution lines, and we average about 8 customers per mile of line, which if you compare that to an IOU, an investor-owned utility, there's probably about 3 times as many customers. But we also cover about 56% of the land mass, and also serve 92% persistent poverty counties. So again, reflecting back on this point, you're directly impacting the persistent poverty counties. So when we're talking about ESG or how to improve people's lives, essentially, well, if the rates go up, you're not really helping with that. So 92% persistent poverty. So this is somewhat an elephant in the room for a lot of people. When I talked about public-private partnerships and things we're doing right and wrong, one of the things that happened a couple years ago that we were pretty heavily involved in was the 100 Days Initiative for ICS Security for the electric sector. It started, I think, on April 14th, I believe, in 2021. I'd actually been NRECA for a total of 2 months, so that was quite the launch into the system. It was an interesting initiative. There was a lot that went right with it. And I think when I say we need to change the design of programs, this is really the sort of thing I'm talking about. There was a lot of good. We focused on control systems. It was wonderful for that. We focused on electric grid security, which was great. Everyone was going the same direction. Public-private coordination was there. We did have, I think, 6 different utility CEOs advising. We had a number of members of the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. We were working with the National Security Council, working with DOE, working with DHS. Everyone was there having a discussion. And people were actually talking to each other. No offense to all the DOE and DHS in the room, but you guys were talking, which was nice. But there was a lot of questions that actually came out of this initiative, and I think it's led to a number of different challenges with these small utilities, actually. We had a fundamental misunderstanding at the beginning of this of what the electric utility structures actually are that we work with. The 2 co-ops that were on the advisory board were both from generation and transmission entities. I'd mentioned this. They don't actually have any customers. They're actually 0 customers. So when we started to focus on only the utilities over 50,000 customers, it immediately deleted all the G&Ts from being part of the priority. We came back and said this, like, hey guys, we kind of need to get them back in there. They're the generation and transmission. Nope, we're not doing that. Oh, okay, great, okay. Let's keep going then. So at the very beginning of this, we weren't really even focused on the structures that actually would help these different types of utilities as well. Amusingly, the 2 co-ops that were on there, both of those were G&Ts, and they were not part of the priority list, which didn't go down very well given they were spending all their time helping advise this. One of the other issues we had was, what were we actually focused on doing? Was it providing information sharing for these utilities to the government, or was it security solutions for the operations? Those things weren't necessarily matching up. There's 2 different ways to do things there, or probably 42 at this point. But it wasn't clear necessarily what the priority was of, do we give the utility a solution, or are we giving the government a solution to get the data? But the biggest one that came out of some of this for me in particular was the sustainability of the solutions that were being discussed. Can we actually keep those solutions in place after 100 days? It was meant to be a sprint for 100 days. We were sprinting definitely for 100 days. Actually, I think it ended up being 400 at that point. It was a long, long year. But we were sprinting in a certain direction for 100 days, and at one point I was like, did we even talk about the cost of anything and how people are going to afford this after this period of time? Nope, we didn't talk about it. So the outcome, I was really excited we were focused on this. There has been a lot of good that has come out of this. We are now a year or nearly 2 years past. We do have incentives to help people deploy these solutions. But we have reinvented some of this program in that the priority list looks completely different now. It actually involves quite a few utilities that are well under 50K because of who they serve and how we redefined critical ourselves. There's a lot going on that's great, but there is still this challenge that we still talk about this in the media, and we didn't necessarily actually get the same lessons learned that everyone thinks we did. We also didn't really have metrics at the end of this to actually say, did it work? One of them was how many utilities signed up and said yes. I can say yes to a lot. Doesn't mean I'm going to do it. So yeah, there was a lot of people that said yes, and we kind of got to this point, but you know, there was an interesting outcome from the whole effort. So one thing that did come out of this, I made this cycle myself because I've been interested in what's been happening over the last year. I do feel that we've actually created this gulf between the large and small utilities on how they're able to apply these solutions. It's gigantic. One of the things I was noticing happening is each different vendor will come out with a new product. They'll find something's going on, and they'll definitely launch that into the media immediately. We'll be talking about it everywhere. Yes, responsible disclosure is a thing, but we'll be talking it all over the news. It will be in whatever EE News thing has came out today. We'll be talking about the latest thing that we found. The next thing that happens, of course, the big customers that have that solution are going to want to get the solution and have it in place, and now they're protected. But we've told everyone that this particular vendor has talked about this solution, and now we're rolling it out there, and we do know there's lots of utilities that just didn't actually apply that because they didn't have the product. The solution might be, okay, now you need to go get your product and you can find it too. Somebody is making a profit off of this, but then we come back and we're like, what do you think the small utility plan is here? Like, what we're going to do? How are we going to defend them? Oh, we're going to give them free services. What? Like, free is never free. You're going to take something. What do you want? Like, so generally it's data. Or we're going to start saying, well, none of you applied this solution, so we're just going to absolutely mandate the use of it. We're going to tell the government that you need to use this, and this is the only way you're going to be defended from, say, Russia. That will happen also. But one of the bigger things was people just getting on social media and talking about all the issues the small utilities have. I'll be honest, that's one of the more difficult things I dealt with in the last year, was reading a whole bunch of stuff on the internet about how bad they are doing and how they can't actually defend themselves. It was a big challenge. So one of the things, I've worked in distribution for 20 years at this point. I know it's shocking, I look so young, but 20 years of distribution. One of the things I was thinking about when I was putting this together was a sort of competition of whose electron is it anyway? What actually belongs to who in the distribution system, and how does our electric grid work? I think all of you saw probably a show talking about how the grid works. I'm still not agreeing with most of that. You know, there's fundamental physics here of how things actually work. But who actually owns parts of the system is really important. In your house, I don't know how many of you have solar on your house or any of those things. I'm looking at Carter, but you know, it's fine. But how many of you have solar in your house? It can be owned by probably 4 different entities, including yourself. It could be owned by the aggregator, which is a group of people that pull things together and sell it back to, say, the large utilities. It could be owned by you. You might have installed it yourself. It can be owned by, I think Elon Musk might own some of it. But it can be owned by any number of entities at this point. You have probably 10 different components that are installed with that. All of those, I think if you listened to Lindsay earlier, all of those have different software components in them that need to be reviewed. Who owns this is really important. But if we want to actually get to this huge distributed future where we're looking at renewables everywhere, we actually need to work that out. When you start saying we need to regulate the distribution utilities because of all this DER that's going online, technically they don't own it. So in lots of cases, some they do. But how do you actually regulate a system that's not actually owned by you? It's pretty hard to work that out. I was comparing it earlier, I think, to the water industry. Can you imagine if you all could generate your own water in the house and collected all the rain together? You could do whatever you wanted to it. You can put chemicals in it, you can put salt in it, you can do whatever you want. You can put vodka in it. Imagine you could pump that back into the system. Would you trust your would you trust your water system if your neighbor could put whatever water they wanted in there with whatever was in it? Oh God, no. But I don't trust my neighbors at all. But would you trust it? Well, we're in a similar boat with these electrons, because technically your neighbor's generating their electricity, they're trying to put it back on the grid, they're connecting it to your utility like a bring your own device program. How do we regulate that? If we don't look at how we control the distributed resources, the renewables, everything else, then it's impossible to say we're just going to look at the wires and regulate that. We're going to regulate aluminium? So it's a really challenging problem. I'm not sure it's necessarily that well understood when you look at the intersection of all the different pieces. That was just one component. The distribution grid is this hellishly complicated system. I love it. It's so complicated, it's amazing. But it's super complicated, and I think that's just one component. There's everything else to talk about as well. So really think about that the next time you're saying we just got to regulate them and they'll make it work. So I'm not just complaining about everyone, it's okay. I do actually have some ideas of how we do this. I have worked in innovation for a long time. I think some of the most interesting solutions come out of not actually being able to afford to do things. The projects you do at home are generally more interesting than the things you did in work for innovation. The thing you did because you went and bought $10 of electric components and now you've made something weird. Well, I'm just looking at everyone in the room who does weird stuff at home. But the innovation in a world that can't really afford your product, I think, is more interesting. I've done it. I love working with small utilities. I've done it at all my lab jobs as well. They're more interesting. They do things more easily. They try things out, sometimes with weird consequences. But they try things out, and it's always interesting to work with them and actually come up with ways that they do things. And actually, if you ever want to hear something weird, just go talk to some of the co-ops about ways they've fixed something, and you'll hear something, and you're like, what did you do? Yeah, it's great, though, because new products come out of that. But things I have in mind here are talking about how people and context matter. It's actually more important in general that you work with the people than necessarily the tools. Value and looking at the different assets you have. One of the things I've worked on in the last few months is actually what value data is, because as all of these different entities are taking ownership of people's data, it actually has a value, and they're losing that value by giving you the data and having no value attached to it. So it's one way to get that return on investment. When we did sensor installations over the last few years, we absolutely had to talk about how to stack value. Nobody actually wants that big sensor that has one use case. They want things that can do 10 different things, and it's the product that will save everything. But also we need to look at normal operations. Your dark sky day sensor, we need to actually work out how those things work every day instead of just on that very bad day. And also looking at interoperability, we learned a lot over the last few years on the smart grid programs of how to make components work together, use different smart grid standards, data standards, and actual cost targets are really important. If you've ever worked with, for example, the solar program at DOE, they have cost targets for everything. I think it was $1 per watt for many years. We don't have cost targets for anything we're working on, so how do we do that? So I like to make fun of myself. The picture's blurry on purpose, so you can't see what 19-year-old me looks like. But one of the things that I think is important is right sizing of the solutions. I worked for a utility many, many years ago. I won't say how long. But when I first turned up, they'd actually really never had a relatively small woman turn up. They were a little confused. And I was working in field crew. They handed me a bunch of gloves and things that were just enormous, because as it turns out, I'm not a small man, which was a bit of a problem. Apparently that was terrible. So my head was big enough, my hands were too small. So the gloves didn't fit, and they actually had to special order new clothes that would fit me properly because I just didn't, and it wasn't really safe. Like I couldn't actually wear the clothes or the gloves because the gloves would just slip off my hand, or I'd just take them off because they were annoying. And that's one of the sort of important pieces of right-sizing solutions. If it really annoys someone, they'll just take it off and throw it away, and that's generally unsafe. I think no advancement actually really matters in this if it mothballs, if people just throw it away. Things need to actually consider the community they're part of, be affordable and interoperable. But things are really important. About 65% of the co-ops I work with have less than 2 IT staff. Some of them have no cyber staff at all. So one of the big things we've been thinking about is human hybrid environments. How do we operate this and make it as easy as possible for them as well? Like, don't make this harder, please. They're already doing everything. I think there's a couple of people I know. There's one of the cyber people who's in my team now who actually told me I was also in charge of the gates. What? Like, no, the gate motor. What? Why were you in charge of the gate motors? He's like, I don't know. They told me it looked cybery. I was like, okay. So data valuation is something I like to think about a lot, actually, mostly because I sign a bunch of data agreements where I hand things over, but not really focusing on all the words that are here because there's far too many of them, but talking about how you stack different analytics on top of things is great. You can have that worst case scenario that your sensor evaluated, but you also probably want to look at how it helps with, say, your distributed resource operation. You can look at load balancing. You can look at load forecasting, which is really important if you happen to live in Texas, as it turns out. You can look at all sorts of things here. But again, you need to work out what your enablers are for doing this and how do you get to that big high-value case. Great. So one story I like to tell. I've got lots of stories about things I've worked on that were funny. I think I've joked that I should actually have a podcast, but no one would understand it, talking about weird things that happened at the national labs. But worked on sensor deployments over the last few years. We were asked to deploy this really fancy sensor. I call it the kitchen sink sensor because we were told it could do everything. Somebody is smiling at me in the audience who was part of this project. We were told to deploy this entirely. We were told to deploy it with a large IOU, get it out there. It was to detect small arcs that were essentially responsible for quite a few wildfires. Essentially, when an arc happens, there's also a noise that happens with it, believe it or not. So this sensor was designed to pick up those tiny thumping noises that come from small arcs that you can't detect with normal sensors. It was pretty cool, but it was also about $1 million of sensor. So interestingly, wildfire is actually the case where there really is a big use case. There has been fires. I've actually been evacuated from my house twice because of wildfires. In California and the West Coast, it is a huge problem. But the installation of this sensor was super complex. We had to pour concrete, break bus bars. We had to do all sorts of stuff to get this in. The data volume was enormous. When we installed it, we didn't necessarily know exactly how to get the data out of it. I didn't design the sensor, so everyone's on the same page. But somebody designed it. We couldn't work out how to get the data. The engineers were just annoyed at us. This is where it gets down to people. The engineers were just annoyed at how complex this was, despite the fact they weren't really even paying for it. And the integration took so long that some of us actually changed jobs in the middle of it, which would be me. The other part that happened during this sensor install, we'd realized that we didn't really know exactly how we were going to validate that this data was real or useful. So I had worked with another type of sensor called a micro-synchrophaser, a micro-PMU. They're pretty cheap, $4,000 compared to the $1 million. I'd asked a couple of my buddies at this IOU, hey, can we install a couple of these at the same time just to get a little more data out of this and help validate the system? The installation took half a day. They got them thrown in the system on the low voltage side. It wasn't in a critical substation. Were easy to adjust those. We could get them there. And also, the engineers were really excited. They actually got to see some data at that point. They were like, okay, something's coming out of this project. Finally, we can see something. I believe to this day, those sensors are still there. This has been for a number of years. I actually don't know if the other one worked. But we have this use case where wildfire really is a problem. We can see it burning, literally. You see the world is burning. But we, again, could still not convince everyone that this very expensive acoustic kitchen sink sensor was actually that important. And I apply a lot of this to the cyber world as well. You can spend $1 million trying to fix your worst problem, but sometimes that 4K solution that just does what the engineer asked can get you much further in solving the problem. Context is actually really important. I don't know how many people know what this line actually is or representing. Anyone who hasn't heard me talk about it? So the line here, the blue, green, and orange, if you're not colorblind, that's actually representing the behavior of an on-load tap changer, which is an electromechanical device. There's thousands of them in the system. They're one of the primary voltage controls for our whole electric grid. Normal operation is a step in the voltage, like you'll see there, the 3 just stepping down. We'd installed, again, the micro PMUs I mentioned, 120 samples a second of data. We installed these at this utility in Southern California. I would spend mornings, for some reason, looking at the data, because we didn't have all the use cases, and I would just stare at it because I thought it was cool. My definition of cool is not very cool. But I would stare at this data in the morning, and I realized that every time there was a tap change, I was seeing this weird dip in voltage and this weird spike in current. It didn't seem good, but again, it was a new sensor, so initially I was like, maybe it's just an anomaly. I was worried enough because I actually understood the context of where this was actually installed, that I was like, okay, that looks like a tap changer's failing. Called the engineer. He was like, well, none of the other sensors have gone off. The oil sensor's fine. I was like, okay, well, he was like, I'll just go drive. Went to see it, and he was like, oh yeah, there's oil in the grid. Great. He's like, oh wait, you just saved the transformer with your weird sensor. I was like, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I was like, I did something right. I ended up, well, I've not made much money in lots of parts of my career, but I actually ended up with a patent out of this because I wrote the algorithm to detect it, and that was great. But this was one of the ways that knowing the context of this system and knowing exactly what I was looking at from the type of behavior of the voltage, that just comes from knowing a lot about power systems, but it was also important to actually installing these sensors in future. They installed, I think, another few hundred of them over time. They still use them. They love them. So if you want to encourage people to do something, you still got to find something to show them, something that's useful. So my last little pitch was operators' attention spans are actually really important. If you think about your flight controllers like that. We'd installed synchrophasers again in Hawaii years ago. I think it was in Maui. We pumped that data into the operations because we're very proud of these sensors being installed. And the operators just looked at me like I had horns in my head. They're like, no, we're not. Like, what do you think we're going to do with that? I was like, I don't know. It looks cool, though. Young engineer didn't do the right thing. But at the time, I realized that the operators were just like, we're dealing with so much on a daily basis. Why on earth would we look at this data stream that we don't know what it is? Again, value stacking, giving the right information to the right people at the right time. So one of the things we're doing, my slides have got weird on text, but we are actually trying to build, this is my pitch for people to come work with us. I don't sell product. I don't have anything to sell you. What I do have is the ability to integrate lots of data into one place. So one of the things we've been building, I think that all of the dispersed vendor solutions, all the different solutions across the country, it's making things a little more confusing for us on a daily basis. So one of the things we've pitched here was actually to essentially build a threat analysis center for the co-ops where we get things pumped into us, and our team can actually help dispatch people to the right place. We can get help. We can send that data to the government if they really want it. But it helps us with working with these rural communities and these rural co-ops in that they have a place to now go with their data that they can talk to that they trust. It's really hard for them to work with vendors independently, but in the role we are in, we can help from a larger scale basis. So my pitch there was, please come work with us. If you're a vendor, we want to take your data. We promise we won't steal it. But this is my last point. These small utilities are keeping the lights on a daily basis. If you work in or live in a rural area, the lights are still on, right? That's what they're doing every day, and generally they're putting out small fires every single day to keep things online. We're dealing with all sorts of things happening. Everything is happening at one time at the moment. If you actually believe in things like the energy transition and renewable energy, we have got to get cybersecurity right the first time, or maybe the second, but at least close to now. I think we might be on second or third at this point, but we've got to get it right. This is my plea here of help us with the little guys, help us work out how to get solutions out to them that work, help us improve their cybersecurity posture. And actually, they are the heroes in this, not the person that put out the big fire that one time. It's them keeping the lights on, the linemen, the people that are out there doing that every day. So, and with that, thank you for listening to me. Enjoy the garden party.